founding of the Grey Nuns in Canada. A couple of years ago, I got a phone call as a result of inundating the government of Canada with emails and faxes by me and my wife. Especially the ministers and deputy ministers who run the departments. The gist of the faxes was nobody seems to know what's going on, It seems like junior clerks are taking over all over the place and doing things that are illegal in the cabinet ministers or the deputy minister's name. Included in what was the cutting down of my old age poverty supplements, then the old age benefits itself, and finally my prepaid pension plan was cut in half, even though I only get half because of my first divorce I had. My ex-wife has the other half, which is just the way it should be. But cutting out my funds was the least of my worries. Most of my worries surrounded the fact that they blocked my wife's entrance into Canada, and they gave her a piece of paper that says should she attempt to cross the border within a year of receiving the paper, she can be locked up for 2 years. She was about 35 miles from me because I'm in Oxford Mills, which is one highway down all the way to the St. Lawrence River called County Road 18. Comes right to our door and goes right to the river and right across the river, which is about 1 mile across, a place called Ogdensburg. The code suggests it means God's portable house. And on the other side of Ogdensburg is a large congregation of Grey Nuns and ecclesiastics seem to basically control that whole area of the St. Lawrence Seaway. There's 11,000 ecclesiastics just in that area, so it became a task that we undertook on behalf of the cell, that if we were going to be blocked, then any time that she's forced to stay there gives us a chance to go around and find out what's really happening. My guess, of course, is that Ogdensburg is the southern tip of the Canadian Shield, and when the water flows to drown out the U.S., a rule of physics will cause a rising of the Canadian Shield, which will mean that Ogdensburg and the space between the three bridges, one is at Massena, one at Ogdensburg, and another one at the Thousand Islands, just this side of Kingston, near Fort Drum Military Base. That whole thing rising will prevent water from flowing from Lake Ontario to the St. Lawrence River at Montreal. Water will be forced out, which means it will flood all of the areas beginning with Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Toledo, Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, most of New York State, southwards from there. It will start to rejoin the St. Lawrence River at about Montreal as it goes past Watertown by a place called Canton. Then town Berlin ends up in Messenia, and of course it makes a mess. A mess of pottage is what the Bible suggests will happen at the end times. It will flood Montreal, which is at the confluence of the Ottawa River and the St. Lawrence, where the Grey Nuns were formed. It became kind of interesting that the Bush family always referred to a New World Order. When you put the accent on the wrong syllables, you sort of give a different connotation. New World Order, you would think that that means for the world there's going to be order, but in fact that meant what they meant was, as opposed to the old world of Europe, in the New World, America, there is a new world, a new order being created called the Order of the Grey Nuns. We were investigating the links that they have, and in Ogdensburg it becomes clear that there is a network of hospitals and hospices for the aged. Some are under the government of New York, some are under by the hands through hospital corporations who basically were on my site at about the same time Jennifer was blocked, my wife. And some, of course, are in the hands of the Grey Nuns, Sisters of St. Joseph, Sisters of Charity, and the Grey Nuns of the Sacred Heart are some of the names they use. Their Mother Superior, Margaret Bourgeois, founded the Nuns Order about 120 years ago, and that was done in Montreal. Then they moved a large portion of their people to Ottawa and finally into Ogdensburg. Now they have people in a lot of places in the U.S. until about a couple years ago. Sister Dora announced that they were abandoning the Northwest Territory, New World Northwest, coming back south. They were created by a French family called Y-O-U, of course, relates back to China in the First Dynasty, where a man called Gun, the shape of this farm is a gun, had a son he called Y-U. So it basically got shifted to Y-O-U, Ville, along the way, and Sister Margaret means Daisy, was not a sister at that time. Where they were located is interesting because it's on an island at the west end of Montreal, separate from the island of Montreal. It's called Dorion. Dorion is just a code word for Orion. Her husband was a bootlegger and smuggler, and one of the things that happened was the French sent a group of Trappist monks, and they set up a booze-making establishment right on the shore there at Oka, where they make cheese. I don't think they're allowed to do it anymore because the government was losing too much in taxes, so they had to sell it to Kraft Foods. But they were making booze there, and the whole idea was, during that time in the 1800s, the Hudson's Bay Company had set up an office in Montreal where they would buy the furs that Indian trappers brought in the spring, and most of those trappers would come down either the Ottawa River or the St. Lawrence River coming from the Great Lakes. Mr. Uville and his gang would go out and divert them from their journey on the water, bring them in, give them booze, buy their furs for another bottle of booze. And the Indians would wake up in the morning having sold everything they had and having nothing to bring back home for a winter of trapping. When he died fairly young in his early 30s. Margaret declared herself poor from somebody who was basically rich to poor almost overnight. Now that's easy to become poor if you give your money away, and that appears to be what she did. She gave the money to a religious organization who allowed her then to create this New World Order. The group is called the Sulpicians. So for 100 years, on one hand, they've been running orphanages. They say that they're finding homes for foundlings. I suspect it's a little like the Latter-day Saints and the Mormon group, where they manufacture babies in order to distribute them into the community. Now, these would not be ordinary babies. These would be babies that have specific traits based on genes that are recessive in nature and only appear later on in life. It kind of helps the media to know where the next mass murderers or mass rapists is going to come from. In any event, that was one of their divisions. They then make a lot of noise about the fact that they are helping the poor and running hospitals for the poor. Of course, that's where they get some of the DNA they're going to use for running a hospital. Finally, they run hospices because when a person has lived out their life, they know basically what's the genetic makeup of that person, and they can use some of that when they're making the new altered eggs that will then be implanted in nuns who have sworn to never divulge the fact that they are married to Jesus, and as such a guardian angel comes from heaven like it did with the Virgin Mary and inseminates them with an egg, and artificially a child is born. With that in background, I asked Jennifer to go ask them for help, since they tell everybody they're there to help, especially women in trouble. Jennifer at the time was 55 years old. She was formerly a registered nurse. Her last employer gave her a job as the director of nursing for a large psychiatric institution. Her specialty is psychiatry and geriatrics. She was making about $100,000 a year and is now unemployed because at every place she went, including the Grey Nuns, nobody responds to her application for employment, which I suggest is linked to this Hospital Corporation of America, which kind of oversees everything in the U.S. So she met with the nun who calls herself Sister Joanne, the facilitator. Sister Joanne is about the same age. She's a fat-bottom lady. She's on the board of directors of both hospitals that are linked to the Grey Nuns, although Jennifer went to both and applied, and they tried to give her an examination for something she doesn't do. If you're a psych nurse, you're specialized in psychiatry as opposed to an assembly line nurse at the door of a hospital. You do some other deed. So they wanted her to do the work of a chemist, usually done by a pharmacist, on the test that they would give her to apply for a job. At the beginning, the nun listened to her story and basically told her that she was a liar, and her past history would suggest that she was on drugs, and threw her out. For a place that claims to help people in trouble, she walked her to the door and slammed the door behind her. A lot of Native people in Canada have met nasty nuns because they were raised by them and abused them all over the country during the 30s and 40s. In Quebec, there were the Duplessis kids. The Duplessis orphans were 20,000 Canadian children who were wrongfully certified as mentally ill by the provincial government of Quebec and confined to psychiatric institutions in the 1940s and 50s. The children were deliberately misdiagnosed in order to misappropriate additional subsidies from the federal government. They are named for Maurice Duplessis, who served as Premier of Quebec for 5 non-consecutive terms between 1936 and 1959. In Ontario and the West, there's all kinds of kids that were put in homes and never saw the light of day. There are stories where the government would pay something like $3 a week to the nuns to take care of them, but there'd be an extra buck if the person was mentally ill, and they would lock kids up in closets for a month until the inspector came, so that they could claim the kid as mentally ill to get that extra buck. Also, things like the kids being abused, dying, being buried in the backyard, but still claiming the funds from the government. That kind of stuff is what they were all about. But mind you, today they are one of the richest orders in the world. End.